Hello, this is Angela from Girl Scouts Heart of Michigan. I'm the program and event specialist for the Kalamazoo and Jackson regions, and I am here today to help you earn step 2 of the Outdoor Art Apprentice badge for cadets. That step is making natural dye, and today that is exactly what we're going to do. We're going to experiment with things we find in nature that occur in the natural world, and we're going to see what amazing color those things out in nature can create. So we're doing this badge in my kitchen because obviously it's one of the supplies. It has the heat source we need in it with my stove. It has water, which we need in it. So the kitchen is a really important supply and location to do this step of the outdoor art badge. Now, you could theoretically do it over a pit fire if you've got some adult supervision as well. You probably should have some adult supervision in the kitchen as well, but I have done this over a pit fire many times. It is nice to do it outside. If you choose certain things to cook, they don't always smell the best. So if you don't have to do it indoors, that's a great thing to have some fresh air. But I don't have that option here, so my kitchen's gonna have to be my place of creation for my dye. Now, obviously you're gonna wanna hit pause in a few minutes after we're done with this to go fulfill this part of the supply list. I recommend going outdoors because obviously this is the Outdoor Art Apprentice badge and you want some things from outside or something from outside that you can turn into dye. So a good example would be maybe you go outside and grab some grass out of the front lawn. Get permission first, or some other plant growing in your yard or garden, maybe something you find on the ground. But you do want a little substantial amount of it. So like in my yard, we have tons of ferns growing. So this is the plant I chose for my outdoor yard, my outdoor location. No one would ever miss these. In fact, they were growing in spots where I have to actually pull the ferns out because they're taking over other plants. I chose this too because I have absolutely no idea what color it will be, so they'll be surprised as far as what the dye turns out to look like on our objects we're going to dye. So fern is what I chose from the garden outside. Now I'm also going to take some things from the kitchen because I do think it's kind of cool that you can make dye out of more than just natural things outside, but you can also do it from natural things like spices, from fruit, from vegetables, from their skins, their insides. They all do different things. So I chose to do the skins of red onions, and I actually had an old red cabbage that started deteriorating. It's not edible at this point, but it will make great dye. So we're gonna do that as well. Now, we've got three options of things to make dye with. You can do as many as you want that you have places on your stove, but there is one caveat to limiting the amount of dye you make at a time, and that is the amount of pots that you have to make the dye in. And the thing is, you don't want to use pots you're cooking food in. You want to have pots that you don't care what happens to, because the process of making dye can be deteriorating to your pot. I'm going to show you the inside of one of these pots. So see how bad the texture is down there at the bottom? So what it does is it eats away of the finish of the inside of the pot. And so you don't want to use something you're going to cook with, because then it can often make the surface unsafe in the pot for food. So you don't want to mix your dye pots and your food pots. These 3 pots that I am working with today came from a used store. I went to Goodwill, and actually where I'm at, there's basically a shop that sells estate sale things that didn't sell at the sale, so you get stuff really cheap. So I got these pots from there. So the other things you're going to need, tongs. I highly recommend these. And I highly recommend a wooden spoon or some sort of plastic spoon, something you obviously in this situation don't care what happens to as well. It's only going to be used for your dyeing. We're also going to need tablespoon and a measuring cup. Look at that. And we are going to need paper towels because you're going to want to be able to clean up any spills that you might have. Now, you're also going to want some things to be your mordants. Mordants are the things that fix the color to whatever you're dyeing. So this one is white vinegar, definitely a great mordant. This is actually the one we're going to use today. But you can also use salt, and you can also use some other minerals and things that are out there, copperworks, ironworks, and when we close towards the end, I'll talk a little bit more about places that you can go to acquire some of those types of mordants. But vinegar is what we're going to work with, and I highly recommend salt. These two work really, really well. Now, they're also found in most of our kitchens, so they're a great option. The other thing we're going to use is alum. Alum tends to help keep our fabric from getting, or our yarn, or whatever fiber we're dyeing, because that tends to be what you're dyeing, from getting too stiff and hard. It can affect the color a little bit, so always it is an option of ingredient to use or not use. You don't have to use it. I like to use it. So we're going to use it today. The other thing that we're going to be in need of that is important, so when we go to basically get whatever we're getting the dye out of, so the cabbage after it's cooked down, the ferns after they're cooked down, we've gotten the color out of it, the onion skins, we're going to need a bowl, big bowl, and a strainer. And so I've got a strainer here, just one. I think this is actually from the dollar store, so no stress, no fuss. And a big bowl like this to put this inside of, see? So we can dump it in. All of the stuff we don't want goes in the strainer. We can pull the strainer out, and then our dye will be in here, and we can throw it into the pot. And guess what? We can put it back on simmer and throw what we're dyeing back into the pot. So you need a big plastic bowl and a strainer. The next thing you need is actually some containers to put your dye in. And honestly, I highly suggest things you would have thrown in your recycling. So here's some containers that already have dye in them. So you can see this is, I actually think, a wonton soup container from Chinese takeout. So yeah, we're using that. There's dye in it. You can actually refrigerate this after you're done with it, and or freeze it and use it again in the future. So, you know, no waste. So this is why I say bring out some containers. You can reuse your dye if you've got some recyclable containers. Now, the other thing that we're going to do that's part of this is we're actually going to record our process so that we can save the findings that we have and how our dye turned out and how it worked on different types of materials. So the first thing you're going to need to do that is different types of yarn. This is, if I can untangle my mess here, what I have in my hand is an acrylic white yarn. Well, it's a little off-white, but basically an acrylic white yarn. And then this is cotton. That's all unraveling here. Oh, what a mess. This is cotton, white yarn. And this off-white is 100% wool yarn. It's a little off-white, obviously. It's pretty natural tone for whatever color the sheep was. But it'll still dye. And you may not even notice that it was colored to begin with, depending on the color of your dye. So you're going to need those. You're not going to need very much of each one of those. I mean, maybe a couple feet. But I highly recommend, if you're going to play with this and do some experimenting, having a skein of each one of those will be very helpful to that. Now, the next thing you're going to need, let me grab it, a piece of paper. You can use an 8.5 by 11 sheet. You'll fold that in half to get a little more stability. If not, this is actually watercolor paper. It's heavier, it holds up better to water. We are working around dye, so you're going to be putting holes in it and tying the yarn to it. So I mean, this is definitely, heavier paper is not a bad choice. You're going to need a pair of scissors. You're going to need a pencil and a hole punch, woohoo, and, oh my goodness, where'd it go? A ruler. And then, of course, I almost forgot a very important thing as far as what you put into your dye to make your dye with. It might be something like red cabbage, and if it's something like red cabbage that you need to cut up to get it into the pot, you need a cutting board. So make sure you have a cutting board. Plus, it might come in handy later when you are trying to take stuff out of the dye bath. So here's my cutting board. So I'll put that on the counter. And you know what? We need something to dye, because one of the things about step 2 is that we have to dye something that we are going to wear. So I had asked my husband to give me a couple of things. I think he's going to give me a bandana or two and a handkerchief. We'll see. And we will dye those for him. And that will be the thing that I'm going to create to give to someone to wear. Maybe you'll have something else, like a t-shirt or something like that, that you might want to dye. Make sure it's something that is okay to dye. I highly recommend looking at the tag to see if it's 100% cotton. It will dye better if it is 100% natural material versus synthetic. We will learn about that as we do our experimenting with our dyes and our ingredients and our fibers that we're dyeing. So outside of that, I think we might have accomplished all our supplies. But there are 2 things I didn't talk about, and they are to protect you a little bit. So I have gloves. We are doing natural dye. I think it's really important to wear them for the most part. I am not the best at wearing them, and sometimes they're really in the way. The nice thing about using natural dye with vinegar and say red onion, this is stuff in the kitchen, so you can always wash your hands right away. But right now you can see there's already from previous things a little purple on my hands from making dye and testing things. So yes, you probably want to wear gloves to protect your fingers and hands and keep it from staining your skin, but it's not, the type of dye that we're making right now isn't that big of a deal. There are other kinds, like if you are making dye and your mordant is something like copper or iron, you really want to wear gloves. Now, the other thing I want to point out is that I'm wearing black. So if you're going to work with dye, it's a really smart idea to wear something you cannot destroy or stain. So I tend to wear black. I could have put an apron on too, I didn't care about, but I thought for this it made a lot of sense to just wear black, because if I splatter it, it is not going to matter if I get it on my clothes. It will not show up. So that is the reason I'm wearing black today. All black from head to toe. Now, that is truly the end of the supply list, and I hope you'll pause and go out in your yard, in the garden, after you got permission, of course, and you made sure that those plants that you are picking from are okay to touch, that you come back and unpause and get some of those supplies out and get your station all ready to go, and we will get started on achieving step 2 of the Outdoor Art Apprentice badge. We are going to get started, and the first part of our process is we're going to talk a little bit about the scientific method. The scientific method is a process for experimentation that is used to explore observations and answer questions. And it's typically the modus operandi of scientists. And even artists use it. They often don't think about it as science necessarily, or that they're being scientific, but they're still using the same process. A good example would be potters or ceramicists and them making the glazes and working out the chemical formulas to make the best glaze or the prettiest glaze, make it turn out correctly in the kiln. They make measurements and they try again, they change the temperature. So they ask a question, which is the beginning of the scientific method. Will these ingredients go together and come out with my desired effect? And then they write all that down. They might do some research in there too to make sure that they're heading in the right direction. And then they mix it all together. They do the procedure. They put the dried piece in the kiln. They heat it up. It turns into the glass coating, the glaze on the ceramic piece. And then it goes through all of the process to cool down, and they pull it out and they look at it and they say, oh, this did turn out the way I wanted it to. Or they look at it and go, nope, that's not it. So then they go back to the drawing board if that's not it, and they reevaluate the process and see if they need to change how much of a certain chemical or pigment or ingredient that they added to that glaze. And then they also look at the temperature and the length of time it was in the kiln. All of these things play into it, and they make notes on the variations, and they go through the process all over again. They stick it in the kiln, it gets heated up after they glaze the object, and then it goes through the process of the cool down after the glaze has turned into the glass surface. And when they pull it out, they look at it again and say, oh my gosh, yes, that's it. Or they say, oh no, that is not it. And they put it down and they go through the process all again if it's not it. That is, in a nutshell, one of the ways that artists use the scientific method. And today, because we're making dye, we're sort of doing the exact same thing. Because we are going to do a procedure to make a color that we want to stick to something. We want it to stick to either cotton, wool, or a synthetic yarn. There is not a guarantee that the procedure we go through will work exactly right. So the other fun part about making dye is we don't always know what color it's going to turn out to be. Say I went outside, you can see my giant greenery back here. Those are ferns from my garden. I've never made dye with ferns. I have no idea what color they're going to turn out to be. If they turn out to be anything, sometimes it doesn't even turn out to be anything. So there's my big question with my ferns. What color will ferns create if I turn them into dye? So what I'm going to do is write down that question. Then I'm going to write down the procedure I went through. So say I took all of the leaves off of the fern stem, put them in the pot. Say there were like 2 cups of fern leaves. And then I put down that I put in 4 cups of water, and I added a cup of white vinegar, and I decided to put a teaspoon of that alum in it that I was talking about earlier in the supplies. And then I'm going to write down the outcome once I've made the dye and dyed my cotton yarn, my synthetic yarn, and my wool yarn. And then I'm going to record by attaching those yarns to my notes. So next time I know this is what happened, this was the outcome. So in order to do that, we're actually going to make our own charts today. That is what you needed the paper for, the pencil, the hole punch, your yarn, of course, because we're going to use that to dye. And that is also why you need the ruler. So we will give you a minute to get all that in front of you, and then we will get started. So hit pause and unpause when you're ready to go. So the sheet of paper I have is actually only a half sheet of paper because it's a heavy paper. It's watercolor paper. But if you have regular 8.5 by 11 paper, like from a copy machine or printer, you can fold that in half. So I would take it and fold it in half so that it looks like my piece of paper right here. You don't need to cut it, just fold it in half. We're making it double thickness. It makes it easier and it holds up better when we add our yarn to our card. All right, now, or actually this way to our card. we've made our die chart. So for the first die we're gonna make, I'm going to do ferns from my yard. I don't know what color it's gonna be. So my question is, what color is going to be made from the ferns? And then I'm gonna write down what ingredients I put in under procedure. I'll get close. Write that down there. And then when we've gotten the yarn out and we know that it's dry and the outcomes, we will attach it through our holes on here. And we'll have a record of whether we had success and we like it, or hey, don't do that again, it didn't work. So my procedure is all written in. Do you see it? There you go. It's all written in, ready to go. So now we're going to get started on making the first die. The pots are on my stove, and so I've started taking the leaves off of my first dye ingredient, which is the fern. I'm going to rip all the leaves off and get them placed into the pot. I'm going to fill the pot up as high as I feel comfortable filling it up. And I'm going to throw away the stems. Next, I'm going to add 1 cup of water, actually, and then another cup of water, and then another cup of water, and then another cup of water. So that total makes 4 cups of water. And then we're going to add 1 cup of vinegar, white vinegar. There we go. We're going to add that. Next, we're going to add a tablespoon of alum, which just allows the fabric or yarn that you're going to dye to stay a little bit softer, and helps the color adhere slightly. All right, now we'll mix. Up the solution, and we are almost ready to turn on the burner. Next, we're going to repeat that process with our red onion skins. These are already been peeled from onions. I saved them so that I can make dye with them. Pour them in, and then we're going to repeat the process. 4 cups of water, 1 cup of vinegar, and then we will move on to cutting up our red cabbage to add to our third pot. Once that is done being cut up, we will do the same thing, but with the red cabbage, we'll double our recipe because it's a much bigger pot. So we've got our 4 cups of water times 2, because this is quite a bit more material to get the color out of. And then I'm gonna put some alum in here. This actually is it's helpful for the material that you're going to dye, as well as the helping with the fixative. And then we need 2 cups of vinegar. And we're going to boil this, cook this down. This is not a fast process. Mixer. gonna simmer since this one's gotten up to boil. We are now cooking down our natural ingredients to get the color out. And it takes about 30 minutes. This is on high time-lapse speed so that we can see it cook down without taking too much time. Once it's cooked down, we're going to need to strain it. So you're going to take a big bowl, put a strainer inside of it, and then you're going to pour out your dye so that the red cabbage or red onion skins or ferns or whatever your natural ingredient is that you are pulling the color from to make your dye ends up in the strainer and not in your final dye batch, and you can then throw it away. But first you're going to remove it from the dye, put that aside, scrape out any extra cabbage from the pot. Make sure that if you do not have safe pot holders, you use a spoon to scrape it out. Then you can put the dye back into the pot, and you can put that back on the stove. Now you can take the cabbage and put it over a bowl and squeeze out the excess into the pot. Now we're going to squeeze out the excess because cabbage especially keeps a lot of dye still in it after you've boiled it down. You'll see there's a little bit there in the bottom before we throw away our cabbage, since we're not going to use it for anything else. All right, into the trash it goes. We'll take this over, throw back into the pot, and now it's time to do the dishes. We're going to repeat the same process for the red onion skins and for the ferns in order to get our dye bath ready to stick our yarn into. Okay, so the next thing we need to do, we need to get our yarn cut so we can stick it in our dye bath. I'm going to turn on the stove and put it on simmer so that our dye stays hot. You can hear it. All right, we're going to go to low. So I've cut off a piece of acrylic yarn from my skein here, and we're going to wrap it around your hand, and then we're going to leave a string. See how I've left a bit there? All right, pull it off my fingers, and then I'm going to wrap it around the center of my skein. So I'm making like a little tiny skein of yarn that looks a bit like a bow, and it has a little string hanging off of it. Don't want it super tight, but there you go. Do you see it? All right, there we go. We're gonna make 3 of these. Take some more yarn off of this. I'll make my 3rd one. Got 2 done. Then we're going to make 3 of these with cotton and with the wool that I have. This one's a bit small. Honestly, you don't need a ton because this is sort of like your example. So you're gonna just use a small piece of it to put on your experiment chart. All right, so I mean, this small one is enough. Now, I have all my bundles I'm gonna take my synthetic and I'm gonna put a bundle in each color. Since I have 3 colors, 3 synthetics. All right, now, here's my wool. So now we add all 3 wools, all 3 acrylics, and all 3 cottons to the dye bath. That's 1 of each type of yarn to each dye bath. Then we're going to let it simmer for about a half an hour. I've basically let all of the yarn simmer in the dye for about 30 minutes now. You can do it for less than that. It really depends on how much color you want in it. Or basically, I would experiment and see. That's the whole point of the idea of that sheet that we created. So I'm going to put down that I put it in here for 30 minutes in the dye bath, so that next time when I look back and I look at the yarn and after I've attached it and it's been months, I can look and go, oh yeah, that was in there for 30 minutes. And hey, I did this again and I only put it in for 15. That's why it looks differently. So, but the longer it's in, the stronger the color typically. Now, there's a point where it doesn't really make a lot of difference. I don't think if you left it in here for 2 hours, it's gonna make a huge amount of difference, but there's definitely a difference between, say, 5 minutes and a half an hour. So I'm gonna pull out my yarn, and I have put a cutting board that I cut up the cabbage on the counter, and I have some paper towels. I'm gonna lay that on top, and then we're gonna lay this on top of that to basically kind of dry out. So we'll get to that. As you can see, I'm grabbing paper towels to place on the cutting board so that I can place the wet yarn onto it, and the paper towel absorbs some of the dye as the yarn cools off and it starts to dry out. I will take the other 2 colors out and place them on the cutting board as well. And then on to the next step. The next step is to take a cup and fill it with water, and then throw the yarn in the cup and start squeezing out the dye. You want the water in the cup to be as clear as possible before you place it back on the paper towel to dry. You're going to repeat this process for all 3 colors. The blue colored dye can actually stain your skin, so I am going to grab gloves. And then I'm going to get some clean rinse water and place the yarn in it and squeeze out some more of the color until it's basically clear. You can see that the color, look at how different the purpley blues from the cabbage are. The colors from the fern, look at the differences in the yellows and the 3 different types of yarn. I think the one that came out the most consistent is actually the red skins from the onion, which is sort of an orangey brown color. Ochre is often the color it makes me think of. Definitely not the color of the onions at all. So the onion skins, which were very much a similar tone to the cabbage over here. So look at those colors. So now we're ready to add these as soon as they're dry. to our recording of our experiments. And then I am going to actually pull the dye, bandanas, and hanky out of the dye bath because we have let them sit for about 20 minutes plus, and now they should be ready to come out, cool off, and then we'll rinse them and they should be good to go. Now that we've made all 3 dyes, the big goal of step 2 is to dye something wearable. And so I actually have some bandanas that I'm going to dye. They are 100% cotton, so they should react the same way as our cotton yarn. So what I'm going to do is take those items and I'm going to place them in my dye bath. And this is a moment when I actually highly recommend gloves. You haven't seen me use them a lot because use them in this video basically up until this point because I'm using my tongs and spoon. But when it comes to larger objects that you are putting in dye bath, oftentimes you have a little more chance of getting the dye on your hands when you're dealing with bigger things and moving it about, especially with splashes and things. I didn't make a comment about the fact I'm wearing black either. That's why I'm wearing black, because if something splashes, it's not going to damage my black clothes. So, all right, let's get those bandanas in my dye bath. One item in the blue, the hankies in the blue, the bandana is in the onion skins, and the bandana's in the fern. As you can see. So we're gonna leave those in on the timer for a bit. So they're gonna simmer for 30 minutes. So I have put paper towel in the bottom of plastic containers here. I used an ice cream container and that bowl that we used earlier. Okay. All right. So I'm going to take the hanky out. Put it in here. One. I'll take this guy out. There's 2. And here's 3. I'm going to shut off my dye baths. Okay. Now, obviously, we have a lot of dye here that we're not using all of. The cool thing is I can take this dye and put it into a container and save it for another project. So I'm actually going to find some containers and I'm actually going to pack them up to put them in my fridge or freezer, and we can use them later. They sometimes aren't as potent, but they are definitely reusable. I've done this many times for school programs and things, so it is definitely something that you can reuse. So we're going to pour the dye in a container and put the lid on it, and we're going to repeat that for the other 2 dyes, and then we are going to clean up and place them in a freezer. The next step is to get a little bowl and fill it with water just like you did with the yarn, and rinse out the bandanas and handkerchief and get the water as clear as possible. Then you can start the process if you have put knots in it like I did to create a tie-dyed look, to start trying to get those knots out. I ran into trouble because the knots didn't want to come undone, so I found a bamboo skewer in my kitchen drawer and I used that to try to aid in undoing the knots. You may have something around your kitchen that might do the same if you're having trouble getting your knots out. The other option is, of course, if you have rubber bands, you can do
the tie-dyed effect just like you would with a tie-dye t-shirt with synthetic dye. So that is also an option. But the bamboo skewer did the job for just knotting the bandana as I did here. Once you've got it undone, you should be able to see quite a differentiation in what has been dyed and what was hidden in the knot. I'm going to rinse it out a little bit more. And look at that. We have a tie-dyed bandana. Look at the difference between the white and the yellow. The fern made quite a beautiful yellow on cotton. Now we're going to try to get the red skin dyed bandana knots out. Squeeze some more of that dye out and keep working at the knot. The fun part, using all those muscles. Ooh, another different type of tie-dye pattern. And look at the differentiation in color. There's the white, and then look at how orange the red skin made my bandana. No knots to untie in the handkerchief since we did not dye it. We just dyed it blue. Very nice blue. Very pleasant to look at. Success. The diagram has been added to as well, and I've written acrylic, wool, and cotton next to the hole punches. Now it's time to add the dyed yarn to the correct hole punch, and I am going to show you how to do that.
The wool. You see that? Not very long. Maybe 6 inches at the most. And what I'm going to do is stick it through the hole in my card. Fold it in half. Sorry, I should give you that. Fold it in half. See how I fold it in half? You can tell that I've done this a few times because I tend to jump ahead and I don't mean to. But here, half. So you got a loop on the end. I'm gonna go to, wait, I should probably figure out. This is not fern, this is cabbage. So I gotta go to the one for red cabbage, sorry. Let's put it in the right spot. Red cabbage is my second one. So you stick it through the loop, and there it is. It's hanging off the card. I'm gonna pull that loop up through, split the loop, and stick the 2 ends through it. So you can see it looks like that, and then I'm gonna pull tight. And then all 3 of my colors are hanging off of there. All right.
I am now moving on to the next 2 colors, attaching them the same way to the card so that I will have a complete record of what I did today as far as creating the color.
This is our card for the 3 types of dye that we made. This is the fern, which I didn't know was going to turn out to be, so now I can put my outcome, and I'm going to write yellow here because I did not know. And this one actually came out blue, and this one kind of came out, the red skins kind of came out in orangey brown. So you've got kind of a nice mix of tones here. Definitely try different things. You never know what color is going to come from it. I mean, I really had no idea that those green ferns were going to make a vibrant yellow on cotton. I didn't know. So experiment, experiment, experiment. Try your hand at a little color science here, and try your hand at dyeing some things that you're allowed to dye, such as a white t-shirt that is meant for that, or a bandana or a hanky just like we did here. I mean, this is pretty fabulous blue, and all made from an old red cabbage that was past its prime for eating, but I could still use it to make something pretty. So thank you for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about making natural dye. And of course, if you are looking for that Outdoor Art Apprentice badge, you can always contact the Girl Scouts Heart of Michigan Regional Centers, and they will help you get your hands on that badge. And of course, if you do dye something and you're very excited about it and want to share, please do. I love to see what you make with the dye that you create. Please let us know what you use to make it and share it in the comments below. Now, I hope you have a free rest of your day, and thanks again for joining us here at Girl Scouts Heart of Michigan for step 2 of the Outdoor Art Apprentice badge. Thanks, bye.